cars. Don was a guy that was, I had worked in the military origin, and there were several Americans over there at that time who were Japanese factories. Am I losing? What's going on?
Put the transmitter on your other head.
Yeah. Bring that over. Yeah, I guess that's it. It's just that's the distance there. Can we bring that over closer? I don't know. Well, I'll just talk from here anyway. There was a certain pecking order in the factories in Japan, of course, with Honda at that time being at the top end, wanting to go into F1. They were considered the #1 racing company in Japan, and then underneath that, Nissan was doing a lot of racing on their own. And Nissan was divided into two different companies in Japan. The guys that had designed the original Jack Zero and were the really advanced engineering guys were working for a company called Prince. And they were the guys that were making the really fast Japanese cars, whereas the people at Nissan were very much into production automobiles with not much interest in that. And they had a young executive over there at that time. His name is Mr. Katayama. And he was constantly trying to put Prince and Nissan back together and put more performance into their automobiles, and doing all kinds of radical things that the board of directors did not agree with. And if you've seen the way Japanese companies run, the board of directors is usually about 10 or 15 guys, at least 70 years or older, and very, very conservative. So anybody came in with a pretty radical idea that they pretty much shot it down. But anyway, since his family was fairly wealthy and owned a lot of stock in the company, they really couldn't throw him out, so they thought they'd get rid of him. And they figured that the worst place that they could send him would be to California and to sell cars over here, because they thought, just being after the war, that there'd be a lot of antipathy toward Japanese cars on the West Coast because of the war. Whereas on the East Coast, there was already some experience with European cars, because Alphas and BMWs had been selling over there. And at that time, Nissan was divided actually into two different companies. There was Nissan on the East Coast, and it was run as a completely different company than this company on the West Coast, pretty much divided at the Mississippi. So Mr. Katayama started his company in California, and he was a very sort of dynamic, very, very quiet guy, but he went around and literally built his dealership out of guys that were little second-hand used car lots or whatever. I mean, he didn't have any money to do anything, but he gained the friendship of these guys that were sort of at the very bottom rung of the used car business in the United States, and made these guys his first dealers. And he made millionaires out of all of them. He created great, great loyalty and built a huge company and very successful. So he started in selling cars at that time. Nissan, they called it Datsun at that time, was 7th in import sales. And of course, Volkswagen was the #1 company. And when we ended up with the program, Nissan was #1 in imports. So anyway, we started out running the 2000s, and then the first car that I got any inkling that we were going to be doing something really interesting was the 240Z. But the program came about from a fairly interesting standpoint, because I had started working out with a Japanese little company called Hino, which is the bottom of the pecking order. As I was explaining, these American guy that came over when I was at Shelby came over with a funny little Japanese car called Hino, and said, I'm running this car in Japan, can you hot rod it for me, and I'd like to take it back to Japan and race it. And it was a car built under a license from Renault. It was like the worst thing you could imagine. It had a real heavy water-cooled engine behind the rear axle like a Volkswagen. It had swing axles, and it was lightweight and just ugly as a mud fence. I mean, it's just a terrible looking little car. But just applied the same hot rod ideas to build this car. And as it turned out, as I was telling you, the first real professional racing that was occurring in the United States at that time was the Times Mirror Grand Prix down at Riverside. And it was a huge race. I mean, it did crowds of, 80,000 people out there. And it was the biggest money race in the world. So consequently, you had all the top names. At that time, the drivers both drove Formula One and sports cars. Everybody would collect at the end of the year. In October, they would come to California to race. So it was a huge, huge event. And the Japanese at that time were trying to look into the United States and see, what is affecting the American market. So they were sending all of their top people over for this particular race to see, how American racing was won and how they might enter and what would go on. And it turned out the opening event for the Times Mirror Grand Prix was a little event called the Mission Bell 100, or 125, I forget what it was.